like to welcome Ellen Semonoff and Dr. Mullins are both in the building, so our speakers are here. So I'm going to introduce Ellen. And so we have this, bio that I will not be reading. What I would like to say is that Ellen, it says 2004, but my experience is that you've been in the Department of Human Services for probably over 25 years at this point, head of the department for the majority. So a very long and hard advocate and leader of the out of school time community in Cambridge. So I think, and we'll say founder of the Agenda for Children Out of School Time. So Ellen wears many hats in the department, and birth to elders is the Department of Human Services. And I think a special place in her heart is held for youth serving divisions, community-based programs who are working in the out of school time hours. And I say made sure in all the years that I've worked with her to center that and make sure that the community, the school district, and all of us feel valued in our work, and has made sure we have the resources to do the work that we do together as professionals in a community. And always, and even more recently with more strength, has stood up for equitable services to low-income families in this city. And sometimes takes a little bit of a beating for it, because there's families in this community that I think have a hard time sharing the wealth. But I think that this community of out of school time providers understands the importance of us standing together to fight for that. And I know it's getting more complex in our community, but Ellen is a member of this coalition as an out of school time leader, and a long time leader in our community. And I just want to, welcome her here and welcome her back. She's always a part of us, but just wants to come up today and share some of the current realities that she's experiencing in her work on the department's behalf and on all of our behalf. And the table conversations that we just had are very much connected to what Ellen is going to talk about. So I want to welcome Ellen Semonoff.
Thank you, Susan, for that lovely introduction. And I want to say thanks to Mercedes for finding an over 20-year-old photo of me for the bio. So people who aren't here today will have a very different impression of what I look like. Hard to remember when that's what I looked like. But anyway, thank you. And it's really, really nice to be here. And I want to start off by expressing my deep gratitude to the Agenda for Children team, all of the team, because throughout the depth of the pandemic and the renewed demonstration of systemic racial injustice, the Agenda stepped up to find so many ways to support the field and our staff. And while we are still, as everyone knows, continuing to experience the impacts of these two pandemics, I really want to salute the Agenda team for its efforts to hold our staff, hold our leaders, and work to hold families who were most in need of support. So a big round of support for them. So I wanted to talk today a little bit about the journey of our department's out of school time programs, and especially our community school lottery process. The intended and unintended consequences of our work have contributed significantly to both positive and negative impacts on programs and on the demands for change in the system. While we made similar changes to our other out of school time programs, and there are people here from those programs, our licensed after school programs, the King Open Extended Day program, and our youth centers, the changes were largest and had the biggest impact in the community schools. And the community schools, because they operate in every elementary school except for Baldwin, which has its own wonderful program, it serves the largest number of elementary school students of any program in the city. and it served the highest number of our higher income families. So we took advantage of the disruption of the pandemic to significantly increase the percentage of lower income families who would be served by each of the community schools by doing two things. First, we changed an arcane system that required that each community school separately bring in revenue to match its expenses, thereby making it more challenging for each program when they had higher numbers of low-income students. So that system did not support our equity goals. So one of the changes was to change that system. We moved that responsibility up centrally. So it now was the burden of our central team to manage that, not the individual programs. And we also stopped our first come, first serve system, which had families in September lining up all afternoon to get into a program, privileging those who knew to be there, who had the ability to take the time to be there, and who knew that they could pay the fee for the program. While we provided scholarship assistance and significant scholarship assistance at programs, families had to apply, and they had no way of knowing at the outset if and how much scholarship they would get. So we changed that system to a sliding fee scale system based on family income. We ran our first lottery for programs in August of 2021 for the school year beginning in September of that year. There were so many challenges for that team, led so expertly by Michelle Farnham and a whole crew across the board that they experienced. And as you all know, changing any system, especially when you're building it while you go, is fraught with challenges. But there was one big, big success. We increased the percentage of low-income children by 200% across those programs, with over 30% of the children in our programs then coming from families with incomes below 65% of HUD median income. So that's a little higher than the school's free and reduced lunch, but it is still, if you are a family living in Cambridge, it is still a very low income. So as I know, so many of the rest of you who aren't in the community school programs experienced, there were deep impacts on families. That meant that so many more families were seeking out of school time programs because they wanted their children to be with other children, to be with staff with whom they were deeply connected, and they needed care. And by reserving spaces for lower income families, more higher income families did not get seats than had been true in the past. So fast forward to this past spring, under Michelle's leadership, the team made lots of changes responding to all the feedback we'd learned from our first lottery, feedback from staff, feedback from families. We moved the lottery forward so that families would know by the end of June, rather than as school was starting, whether they had a place for September. We did much greater outreach to reach more low-income families, partnering with the agenda and with the village to reach more families. And we set a higher goal for the percentage of low-income families that we wanted to serve in our programs. So again, the intended and unintended consequences. By the close of the lottery, at the beginning of June, we had 1,200 applications for 700 slots. We provided priority access to the lottery to families, and I'll give you the figure. So for a family of 4, 65% of median income is $91,000. Sounds like a lot of money in some places in the country. Not a lot of money for a family of 4 living in Cambridge. You could be eligible for public housing with a higher income than that. So we continued to see growth in the percentage of lower income children that we accepted in our programs. It will come as no surprise to anybody in this room, I am sure, that our focus on lower income families also served to create greater racial equity in our programs. 82% of the families who identified as Black or African American who applied to our program were priority applicants, compared to 18% who were general applicants. By contrast, 16% of the families who identified as white were priority applicants versus 84% in the general lottery. So our focus on income also had a dramatic impact on changing the racial makeup of our programs. I would say, and there's more detail, and Michelle could answer more questions about this than I could, was actually for both Asian American families and for those who identify as Hispanic or Latinx, it was much closer. The lottery by priority or non-priority did not make that big a difference for those families. But I want to give a big shout out to the community school directors and staff who have been the front line all this time, hearing from families and operating under a changing system that has many benefits, but also so many challenges. So we accomplished our most significant goal, which was creating much more equity in our programs. And as you can imagine, there is in this city great support for creating more equity. But as you also know, when there is a limited service that is greatly in need, our equity goals smash up against the demand that we create enough services for everybody who needs and wants them. Which brings us to the current conversation about how do we collectively address the demand for greater access for families for out of school time. And I say collectively, because we have been clear, that is the department has been clear from the outset in all of our responses to our elected officials, to our school department colleagues, that the issue of providing high quality, affordable out of school time programs for Cambridge families does not and cannot be addressed just by city programs, but needs to be addressed in the context of the needs and opportunities within the whole system. We know, and you know, that there are many critical pieces that we need to address as part of the process to look at how we provide more services to Cambridge families. You also clearly know many of the barriers that currently exist to expanding services. We can't provide quality services if we don't have the appropriate staff to deliver those services. We can't provide equitable services for children who have different needs if we don't have the staff who can help support children in programs. And even as many of us have increased the rates of pay for our part-time staff and even for our full-time staff, we are still struggling to find adequate staff. And when we hire staff, we are often hiring staff with less experience than the staff that we used to hire. So the needs for training and support and supervision are much greater. We can't provide quality services if the rates that family can pay, or the state pays, or the city subsidizes, don't cover the cost of programs. So funding created through the pandemic helped create for many programs a lot more resources, but it's not a stable source of funding, and it has not even then been adequate to support all the needs. There's not adequate space currently in the city to expand services for all the families who are currently seeking services. And I want to give a big shout out to Superintendent Greer, because unlike her predecessors who did believe that out of school time was important, she took a stand that she was going to principals to tell them they needed to make some more space. And so we have a little more space once we have staff that we can use. But it's not yet clear whether there is a much larger possibility for more programming space in schools. And there needs to be a much larger conversation about what that space looks like and who might provide the services in that space. Our staff and our families are still so deeply impacted by the pandemic, and the needs of our children and staff for more social emotional support is huge. We need to find more ways to support all of our programs, the staff and the children and the families. We can't expand programs without paying deep attention to the quality of those programs. The agenda has been the centerpiece of collective efforts here, and we need to continue and to support and expand that work for the benefit of all of our programs. And we need to continue to center the needs of our traditionally marginalized families as we do this work. As is always true, change often happens because families who are more able or willing to advocate for themselves become more active. Their voices are the ones right now that the elected officials at the city council and the school committee are hearing most strongly right now. And these are parents who are deeply impacted as well by the lack of childcare and quality programs for their kids. But it's causing them to advocate for greater access to out-of-school time programs. I just want to say that even as we have sometimes been pushing back and been perceived, frankly, as not being particularly sensitive to the needs of higher income families, that demand offers the greatest opportunity for all of us to use that renewed energy and that demand to look at what it would take to build a more equitable system that provided more out-of-school time access for families, taking advantage of all the programs that exist. So when we think about what an expansion study looks like, and I know that's actually what I was asked to come talk about, just want to acknowledge that was my charge. We know that we can't expand without more resources, without more partnerships, without more input from families, without more input from programs, without more focus on quality, and without more deep connection to the schools. And so that has to be the way in which we move forward. And I just want to say we've been in this place before, which some of you will remember. And it has to do with access to preschools. And when our department, under the leadership of Megan White and Michelle, moved to a lottery-based system a number of years ago with priority for low-income families, it created a similar firestorm from families who lost what had been their easier access in a first-come, first-served system that you had to sign up for or could sign up for the day your child turned 1. So if you didn't know, you didn't live here, you didn't put your child on that wait list, you had very limited access to what are our amazing preschool programs. While it was not the only reason for the push, the process of our privileging low-income families played a large role in the huge support from the city council and ultimately the school committee for the need for a universal pre-kindergarten program for all 4-year-olds. While the initial demand, again, was that the program be a school-based program. I think schools probably are programs that were in the schools. We knew that we couldn't build a system that didn't include all of the partners. And when this was presented to the city council and the school committee by the then superintendent and city manager, the strong recommendation was for a mixed delivery system, that there would be 4-year-olds served in the schools, 4-year-olds served in city programs, and 4-year-olds served in community-based programs. And this effort will bring significant new resources to community-based programs that have lacked those resources. So I see the demand from our elected officials to create more programs in the schools for city programs to be a similar process. We can't and shouldn't build a system that does not provide access and support for the broad array of programs that serve families well inside and outside the schools. Under the leadership of the Agenda for Children, we're hopeful that we will be engaging in a process to look at what we have, what we need, and a roadmap for how we might get there. It won't happen overnight, and that's sometimes very hard to explain to the families who desperately need childcare. But we can't build a system without going through the process of making sure that we take account of the interests of families, the interests of our staff, the interests of programs, and what are the resources we need and how can we make it happen. So that's my pitch. All right, so I think I have maybe 5 minutes, right? Okay. So let me go back to, do you need me to reread the questions or just tell you which one I'm answering? Okay, so I'm gonna go first to this table. This is about what data is collected around staff retention and how could we use more effort at the staff level to actually review that data. So I'm going to go to the second question first because it's a little bit easier. Kari and the team have done an amazing job back when we were doing the equity bridges. Is that where I got this from? Where we were doing incredible work with looking at data and having the people who were impacted in some way by the data actually do the analysis of that data, and people saw very different things than I might have seen in it or somebody else might have seen from where they're sitting. And so I love the idea of how can we look at our data and do process and then make meaning of that data in a way that can be useful to us. And as to the first question, I don't know that we're doing a very good job of collecting the data at the level we need to, because we have certainly experienced over the course of the pandemic, the huge drop in our part-time staff, our rehiring of staff, our losing staff, rehiring. And so I don't have an answer, but I actually think it's something that we need to pay close attention to, because if we don't know what's happening exactly, it's much harder to make meaning of it. So really like the question. I'm a for-profit childcare provider. It's a great question. I don't know. I would have said, oh, talk to the agenda. They probably have a better idea than I do about that. But what I would say is, I think KinderCare is the one that I see. I don't know that there are a lot of other ones, but it's definitely worth paying attention to. And the one thing I would say from my experience on the preschool side, the for-profit providers play less well than the nonprofit providers. So while there is an issue about whether we think the care is appropriate and all those other things, the for-profit sector does not appear at that level to be paying. And I'm guessing the same would be true on the after-school side. So I don't know that they're at risk of stealing the staff, but I do think it's worth trying to figure out, are they in fact coming into the city? I haven't personally seen that evidence, but it might be there. I really like the question about many people in the nonprofit community not knowing what was happening and seeing the impact. And I've had conversations with a number of the directors of nonprofits about exactly what they are seeing, which is the demand from higher programs, which have traditionally served primarily low-income families, serving those families, but also now getting huge wait lists of families who are much higher income, who are trying to access those programs. And I do think that there's a really interesting question, which you put right on the table, about mission. And how do we think about that? Because does it mean no higher income children in your programs? Does it mean how you, so there's a really important issue there. And I want to own the piece about, I would say that if there's a big failure that I hold from our whole process, it would be communication. And that is internal communication to our own staff at every point about exactly what was happening. And it is certainly external communication to the people who would be impacted by what's happening. And so I don't want to make promises that I can't keep or won't keep. But what I want to say is I hold that as very important. And I see that the work that we need to do together moving forward requires that we be in much better communication about what we are all seeing. Because when I said earlier about this isn't really just about the city, it may be being framed at the moment about the city solving the problem. I don't think the city can or should be the one that comes in to solve the problem. I think we would lose something very important and wonderful if that's what happened. But I do think that our collective process to look at what is it that we need to build and how will we build it will require that we be in much closer communication. But I will acknowledge that that wasn't, and I'm imagining you all have had that experience. You're so busy trying to make something happen that your ability to lift your head up to answer, to communicate, is really, really hard. And then I think that how can we best partner with the city? Well, I think it's in part the onus is on us to help make that easier. And I do think that's part of this process for how do we look at the expansion, I think will help us do a better job of partnering. And then finally, I can't really answer the question of what the broader OST landscape looks like. And you didn't really think I was going to answer that question. But I will say, of course, we don't have the collective resources right now to serve all the young people with out-of-school time programming. And so one of the things that needs to happen is if we are collectively going to expand the number of children who are served in high quality settings, we will collectively need more resources to make that happen. Thank you so much.